Alright, so in this video, um, I'm going to be doing a more in-depth view of metatables and object-oriented programming because I know my last metatable video wasn't that specific for say, but in this episode I'm actually going to show you with Python, which is much more object-oriented than Lua. So essentially object-oriented programming is using objects and classes to shorten and reuse code. That's essentially what object-oriented programming is. For instance, if I were to create a class, I'm going to call it Apple. I just created a class called Apple, which is an object. So now I created an Apple object. Now when I do that, I have to have the actual .new function or the function to create the object. So in this case, in Python, it's initiate. Now, once I initiate the class, it will make a new Apple class, right? So if I were to make another Python file, actually, I'm not going to do that. If I were to do class apple dot initiate, and I were to print apple, it would print the new object, and it said, oh my gosh. It would have print apple object at the memory address. So this means that I just created an object where that memory address is. So that is basically what metatables do. More so proxies than metatables, but they take up a space in storage for say that essentially they can be used to call functions and shorten. It's not the fastest type of programming, keep that in mind, but it's the most effective for saving and reusing code. And that's why major industries use it, and that's why C++, Java, C#, Python, all these languages use object-oriented programming for that specific reason, because it's not the fastest, but it's the most clean code you can get, as well as the most neat. So let's say if I wanted to create add some variables, well, or add some attributes to this class. So I would go ahead and pass some variables through, or parameters through. So I'm going to give the size parameter, I'm going to give the color parameter, and then I'm going to give a age parameter in days. All right. Oops, it's not C++. Calm down now. All right, so now when I create this, I have to actually tell the class what these actually are. So to do that, I would do self dot size color, then self dot age equals size color and age. So since I set these default values, theoretically I would not need to actually do anything. Lua doesn't have that built in. You have to do it manually, which is just sad because it's so much easier to just do this, but it's not. But now we notice it's red. But what if I wanted to change the color? So I would do, so let's say the size is 5, the color is yellow, then the age is 5 days, 12 days. Oops. So now if we print it, we notice we have 12 days, we have the size is 5, and the color is yellow. Now, you may be thinking, well, how is this useful? Well, that's where I can get to this. I can create another apple called green apple and create another apple. and give the same green. And we'll do this ages 2. Make this 3. And then we can actually go like this and name this yellow apple. And I'm going to give this one 4, let's say the age 6. Now we can go print yellow apple, green apple, right? And then we can go print the yellow apple's color as well as the green apple color. And they're different. You see, the yellow apple's color is yellow, and the green apple's color is green. So this is object-oriented programming. You create different classes with different functions. Now, what if I wanted to make a function that rotted the apple? Well, I would add another parameter, and I'd call this rotted. Or no, I wouldn't actually. I would do so. I just do self.rotted equals false. It's a capital F in Python. So we're going to go ahead and rot the apple. So if we got to check to make sure it's not already rotted, and we have to do self to reference the object dot rotted. Then we're going to go ahead and do dot rotted equals true. And now we just created a rot function. So now if we print green apple rotted, you will notice they're both false. However, if I decide to change that by calling the green apple rot function, it's now true. So the green apple is now rotten. Now how does this tie into Roblox? Well, let's create a metatable and find out. So we have a table. We're just going to call this class. We're going to return that class, right? Because we can't, a module script's required to return a value. So remember how we had this initiate function? Well, that's basically what the metatable function is. So first we have to actually index the object that we're going to, the table that we're going to get the information from. So a rundown of what index does, it literally just indexes the table. It returns the index in the table that you're calling. And if that table index doesn't exist, it returns nil, which is useful for creating new table slots without having errors. That's essentially what it does. So for instance, class this, if I were to make this a function, the first argument's the table. The second one, I believe, is the index. Then if I were to print table and index, and I were to call that function, I can't do that yet. I'd have to go class.new. This is the initiation function. .new is initiation. And then return set metatable. We're going to do that. And then I'm not going to put any properties in yet, or attributes, just for testing, to show you how index works. We're going to get the class, just require server storage.class. Then we're going to do class.new. So we're going to create a new class. So now if I were to do new class dot A, and run the game, we notice it says nil, it doesn't exist because this, and it called the index function. So in other words, it printed out the table that it's coming from, which in this case it's this table because this is where our metatable is. And it said, okay, it wants to call index A. Well, in this case, In this object case, our metatable here, there's nothing in it, right? So that means A index is nothing. So I'm going to go ahead and return nil, and because of that, it printed nil. Now, if I were to put an A here, it will print 2, and it would notice the index function will not fire because the index actually exists. So essentially, index fires when there is no index with that specific key or number in a table or metatable. Now that we know how index works, we can just reference class, which is going to go automatically do the function. So now I'm going to do, I don't know, I'm just going to make an apple class to make it simple. So I'm going to do color equals, red is going to be the default color. Actually, no. Color, the age, and the size. So the color is going to be the color, the age is going to be the age, the size is going to be the size, and the rotted is going to be false. So now I'm going to actually do this, if not color. Ugh. Then color equals red, if not age. So we're just going to estimate that. So now we have these right here, these presets that we can't do in this language because it'll error. So now we have that. So now if we create our class and we print out new class.size, we notice we have 2 because our size is 2. Now if I would actually want to set the size, I could do 5, and I'm going to, or the first parameter is color, right? Yeah. So red, then the size, or age, would be, I don't know, I'm just going to leave it as nil, and then 5 would be our size. So now our size is 5. So what if I wanted to add another function to maybe rot the apple? We would do function, class, semicolon. Because semicolon references the object. If we did a period, we'd have to actually put self in as a parameter. So if I were to do class dot rot apple, and if I were to call this function, it's true. So if I were to call this function, it says, okay, well, what is self? It doesn't know what self is. And if I were to run it, we will get an error. Oh, yep. See, we get an error, and it says attempt to index nil with rotted. Now that's because it doesn't know what self is. Right now, self is nil. See, if I print self, it would print nil. So in order to do that, we have to either do this, pass self as in as a parameter, and then we have to actually pass the object. That's one way to do it. And then we notice our rotted is true now, because we just set it to true after we printed our object. This is our object. Or the simpler way would be just to do this with a semicolon. We replace both the calling of the method and the actual initiation of the method using a semicolon, the 2 dots on top of each other. Now, if we call it, no errors. We don't need to pass the object through anymore. So that is what that means, the semicolon means. Now, what if I wanted to, you know, unrot the apple or make a new apple? Well, it's really simple. You just create, we're just going to call this yellow apple. We're going to call the age of this to 0. We're going to set it to 2, which is we're not going to do that, the defaults. We're going to do that. Red apple equals class dot new red green and we're going to do green. So then I'm actually going to do a table. Is table, array, whatever you want to call it. We're going to do apples red equals the yellow apple. What am I doing? Equals red apple. And then apples green equals green apple. Apples yellow equals yellow apple. So now if we run, we notice we have 3 different apples, all with different properties, right? Because the colors are different. Now, if I were to go through and do a for loop for that, for the apple name, and then the apple data, and we're going to get the table apples, and then we're going to print the apple name and the apple properties. So we notice yellow apple has a yellow color, the green apple has a green color, and the red apple has a red color. Now, what if I wanted to, use the meta method doIndex? Well, that's a great question. First we have to start with what newIndex is. So newIndex has the same as the other one, the table, the index, and the value. So now I'm going to go print the table, right? And then I'm going to print the index and then the value. So what newIndex does, it fires whenever you try to put a new value inside of a table. So for instance, if I were to do green apple dot pair equals true, it would fire the newIndex method. We notice it says the object, right? Bruh. So it says, notice how it says, okay, so our table, our object, so we call the green apple, and we have pair equals true. So if we look back at our class, that is what it does, right? So it does that. What it is useful for, let's say you wanted to prevent people from adding new tables, adding new objects to your table, you can just return the error or warning. This table is locked, and then you could use the locked meta method function, which I don't feel like getting into in depth with. And we notice that our green apple actually doesn't have pair equals true, because we said, hey, we can't do that, and we returned, instead of doing this, instead of actually letting the table go through, we said no, that's not allowed. Now if we did want to, we could go table, then we could go the index equals the value. Oh yeah, I can't do that. But the point is that if this newIndex method fires, it's called whenever you attempt to make a new index. That new index could be anything that's related to your object. If you do self dot, you misspell a variable, or you misspell an attribute. Let's say you have color, but you added a U, like the Europeans do. You would run into a new index, and it would say, hey, that doesn't exist. So it's good for if you want to make sure that your variables and parameters, arguments, all that stuff is 100% correct and not misspelled. Because if you do actually create that new index, then some of your other functions that are using the old index that you think you're supposed to be using won't recognize the variable being changed, and that's bad. Now, there are other meta methods that are in existence, but these are the most common ones that are used. But so in summary, I guess we talked about object-oriented, how it shortens code. Instead of doing this, 3 times per object apple, we did it once, and we simply just called the function, and we did this 3 times, 2 times, and we shortened the code to 2 lines and 1 line instead of 7 or 8 lines. And that's also what we did here. We could have done this multiple times. We could have copied and pasted this like this for each class. Let's say we want to have 5, 10 classes. It'd be, or 5 or 10 objects. We could have had 200 something lines, but instead we just have the the 23 that we're left with. I think that's about it. So to recap, index calls when there is no, the index meta method calls when there is no index with that specific key. So if I were to call yellow.pair, it would call the index because pair doesn't exist. And if I were to say pair equals true, it would call the new index method. And if you do not specifically tell that meta method to return, then it would set a new index without warning you. You have to use that function that I did, this function right here, if you want to make sure that nothing else is added. And that's about it. If you have any questions, message me on Discord or Roblox. See ya.